LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. My name's Greg Moffat and this is the end of the world as you know it. The beginning of the end of the industrial age is upon us, and my guest today, John Michael Greer, will be telling us why. John is a certified master conserver, organic gardener and scholar of ecological history. The current Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America, his widely cited blog, The Archdruid Report, which you can find at thearchdruidreport.blogspot.com, deals with peak oil amongst many other issues. In his compelling book, The Long Descent, John presents a challenging new vision of the future, traces the decline and fall of an industrial society fatally out of balance with planetary limits, and shows how personal change and local action can shape a better tomorrow. Hello and welcome, John Michael Greer, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
John, we are here today essentially to talk about the end of the world as we know it. Specifically, as set out in your 2008 book, The Long Descent, which is subtitled A User's Guide to the End of the Industrial Age. Mm-hmm. Now, perhaps the listeners, you could set out an overview of The Long Descent and just your basic premise in writing it.
Okay, well, basically, there's a lot of misunderstandings about our society and our role and place in history just at the moment. A lot of people have convinced themselves that we live in the kind of very abundant, very highly supplied with technology, very lavish world with the lavish lifestyles we do, because we're smarter than anyone who ever lived before us, or because we've built up this vast amounts of information, or there are various versions of the social mythology that kind of feeds into this. But when you take a hard look at the situation, the reason that we have all of the wealth and all of the abundance, the strawberries in January, all this kind of stuff, is that we've been burning our way through the Earth's stash of fossil fuels. We've been doing it at a remarkable rate. And the consequence of this is that we've been burning it at a rate that cannot be sustained. We've reached the point at this point that roughly half the Earth's original accessible quantities of fossil fuels are basically gone now. And what that means is that supplies are beginning to run short, just a little short at this point. There will be more of that as we proceed, and the further we go, the higher the demand goes, the more the supply declines. We're facing a situation in which we can no longer maintain the industrial society that we're used to. At that point, it's a fairly rough road because, again, our entire society is geared to having things shipped across countries, across continents, around the world in container ships. Our entire society is geared to being able to replace vast amounts of human labor with machines powered ultimately by fossil fuels in one way or in the other. And you can't maintain the kind of society that we've got. You cannot maintain the size of the populations we have if you don't have that sort of lavish fossil fuel subsidy backing it up. So the long descent is the consequence of that. I call it the long descent because it's not an instant thing. It's not the kind of overnight Hollywood fantasy collapse that so many people dream about. It's a gradual process because the fossil fuels don't run out all at once.
Yes, I mean, even in, you talk about in a rapid collapse, even in like the original Mad Max and Road Warrior movies, mm-hmm. which are probably the Hollywood archetype of that sort of thing, it opens the film with a segment about, the leaders talked and talked, but eventually, the oil ran out and the great machines sputtered and stopped, and then suddenly we all started cannibalizing each other. And that was a fairly dramatic, fairly short-scale collapse. But what you're talking about, 100 years, 200 years, as we gradually move to a new world.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing that I point out is that we actually have a very large amount of information about how civilizations sputter and grind to a halt. Most civilizations in the past have done some variant of this. They've overshot their resource base, just as we're doing. And they've been through the same process that we're facing on different scales with different technological bases, sure. But it's the same process, and it usually takes between 100 and 300 years. It's very fashionable to insist that, well, we're different, we're special. But I see no reason to think that. My working guess is that we're in the early stages of a process of decline that's going to last far beyond our lifetimes.
Now, the situation regarding the oil supply that you referred to is basically known as peak oil. Mm-hmm. And for the technical insight into that and all the numbers, people can, for the time being anyway, can go online and kind of look that up for themselves and make up their own mind. But one thing that can't be how can I put it, manipulated or twisted or changed in any way is the fact that everything, as you referred to just a moment ago, in our modern world depends on oil, and oil itself depends on oil for its production and transportation. If I look around where I'm sitting right now, not only is all the plastic and all the systems that you and I are using to talk to each other, there's a plastic water bottle here. Everywhere I look is plastic, which is all oil. And if it isn't plastic, it's some other form of semi-synthetic material which has been made from oil, and oil to transport it, oil to manufacture it in the first place. You can't move 1 inch in this world without coming across oil as part of a process.
Very much so. And of course, all of the other energy sources that we've got are also dependent on oil at this point. Coal, for example, is not being excavated at this point and shipped using coal-fired equipment. It's being mined with diesel machinery. It's being transported on either diesel trains or diesel trucks. And this is also true of the various green energies, of which there's been so much hoopla. Okay, wind turbines are all, these green energies, so we're told. But in fact, they're manufactured on equipment that is powered ultimately by fossil fuels. They're made of materials that are mined, prepared, synthesized, what have you, for either using fossil fuels or directly from fossil fuels, fiberglass, for example. The components are transported, assembled, set up, burning a lot of diesel power, and the continual maintenance that they require. Again, you've got to have somebody able to go out there in a truck, and that truck is not powered by a wind turbine. That truck is powered by oil. The consequence of this is that most of what we're being sold these days as, quote, green energy, unquote, is simply a roundabout way of burning more oil.
Yeah, it's just a question of what, it's not as direct. It may not send smoke into the air at the point of use, but it doesn't mean that it was any less dependent on oil. And of course, anybody who looks at the renewables situation right now, whether you're a critic or whether you're an advocate, it's clear that they're nowhere near. They're fulfilling 1% and 2% sort of amounts here and there of energy requirements. And if you then look at what would be required in theory, even if it could be done in practice, but in theory to get them up to providing a useful percentage of our energy, you would then say, okay, that requires us to build however many turbines or however many photovoltaic cells. And what would that take in terms of our current energy use? And the net result would be that in order to get renewables up to something like a useful percentage, we'd have to divert oil in massive quantities away from things that we use it for every day.
Exactly. This is one of the things that has been increasingly a source of worry in the peak oil community, because most of certainly the governments, the advocacy organizations, the corporations that are out there selling wind turbines and photovoltaic arrays and things like that, nobody's talking about how much energy would it actually take to make these potential future energy sources possible. There's always an upfront cost. When there was all that talk a few years ago about the hydrogen economy, we're all going to power our cars on hydrogen. Okay, fine. First of all, nobody was talking about how we were going to get the electricity to break apart water to manufacture the hydrogen. But the other problem is that let's say you want hydrogen-powered cars. Think of how many trillions of pounds and dollars, and choose your other currency units, over the last 100 years have gone into building the infrastructure that gets petroleum, through from the well to the refinery to to the forecourt where it's sold to the user, and all of that stuff. All of that would have to be replaced from the ground up with a comparable hydrogen infrastructure, because you can't put hydrogen into an ordinary gasoline pump. You can't ship it over a petroleum pipeline. The whole infrastructure would have to be bought and paid for before you could actually replace a significant fraction of your cars. And that immense overhang of money, of labor, of resources, and especially of energy is something that our society can no longer afford to do.
Well, when we look at possible alternatives and where some action has been taken, one very sharp, painful example of what happens when you start to divert energy use away would be the whole ethanol debacle, which has affected food production and food prices.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't, all that they've been able to do, is, broadly speaking, is pad out the supply of gasoline somewhat. You can't use 100% ethanol, or even more than about 10 or 15% in an ordinary automobile without damaging the engine. So we've gone to all this trouble. We've manufactured this flurry of ethanol refineries. We've diverted huge amounts of food stocks into ethanol production, driven up food prices across the world, starved heaven knows how many poor people. And for what? So we can pad out our gasoline supply a little bit.
Now, younger people won't remember this, but those of us of a certain age will remember that a concern, quite acute concern about dwindling oil supplies and the ramifications of it. There was actually a period in time when this was quite prominent, the 1970s specifically. Mm-hmm. And as you write in The Long Descent, there was quite some positive action at this time. Mm-hmm. But then something happened, and it all kind of got binned. That consciousness and that awareness went away very quickly, and then into the 1980s, in the Reagan era, oil suddenly became very affordable again, and that there was any talk of austerity or a future of reduced resources or limited energy use was poo-pooed effectively.
Well, basically, by the end, I was involved kind of as a teenager underfoot in the alternative energy scene of the 1970s. I expected to make my career in that field. And so I remember there was a lot of very fierce debate, because most people realized that you couldn't just keep on using fossil fuels indefinitely. That was going to end with industrial society running face first into the brick wall of fuel depletion. So the two proposals that were basically on the plate at that point were, on the one hand, an approach using renewables and especially massive conservation and efficiency measures so we could maintain decent humane lifestyles on a small fraction of the energy we now use. That was choice one. Choice two was to go whole hog into nuclear power and gamble that either breeder reactors or fusion power could be made commercially feasible before the fissionable uranium ran out, which is actually a major issue, because neither one of those technologies, neither breeder reactors nor fission reactors, have proved to be economically viable. But those were nobody knew that at the time. Those were the two gambles. Both of them both of them very, very serious challenges, both of them with major upfront costs, and both of them very politically difficult. What happened in most of the industrial world at the very end of the 70s, the early 1980s, you had a bunch of what I think you'd have to call pseudo-conservative administrations get into power. Thatcher in Great Britain, Reagan in the United States, and so on across the board, who said, no, we don't have to do that. The free market is an omnipotent supernatural force, and it's going to solve all our problems for us. And in fact, we're going to take these newly discovered reserves in the Alaska North Slope and the North Sea, and we're going to pump them like there's no tomorrow to crash the price of oil, so that everybody's going to be happy again. We can all get the SUVs. It's happy motoring from here on in. Don't worry about the future. And I am embarrassed to say that a vast number of people across the industrial world in the United States and Great Britain and many other countries fell for it. They looked at that and they said, well, yeah, but I'd really rather have the big car. I'd really rather have the cushy lifestyle. Even though those oil reserves, the North Sea, the North Slope, were what was going to make it possible for us to make the transition, one way or the other. That was going to be stretched out, eked out over decades, over a couple of generations, to cover the energy costs we couldn't fill from either the conservation of renewables or the nuclear path. And instead, we burned it to manage 30 years of luxury.
It's
30
like
years of keep the party going.
And I suppose it's like being in the desert or something with your last liter of water, and you're deciding, do I rinse my mouth out with this once a day, or do I use the whole lot to wash my hair right now? And saying, oh hell, I'll wash my hair.
and that's exactly what we did. Well, and that was the issue. And so we washed our hair and probably blow dried it, and now the vultures are gathering, and people are starting to complain. But it's a little late for that. Well, unfortunately, we could have made the nuclear option would have been a fatal dead end. I mean, that's pretty clear at this point. If we'd chosen the route of conservation, efficiency, and renewables, we could have made a relatively smooth transition into what, in the book we'll be talking about another time, I refer to as an ecotechnic society, into a situation where we're maintaining a relatively high level of technology and a fairly comfortable, decent, humane existence for people, on a much, much, much lower energy basis. We didn't make that choice. Now we're in for it.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the ecotechnic future, by the way. It's sort of like a companion piece in a way to the Long Descent. I mean, people may as well know that's out there as well. Well worth reading both of them back to back, I would say. But two things about nuclear that a lot of people doesn't dawn on a lot of people. One is that the creation of nuclear power still requires a fuel source. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't come out of nowhere. So, and that in itself, the fuel for nuclear reactors is a dwindling resource on the Earth anyway.
Very
and
much so.
Nobody has figured out what to do with the waste after all this time.
Well, yeah, minor little point, yeah. In fact, the nuclear thing was always presented, certainly back in the 70s, as a way to bridge the gap. We've got nuclear fission now. We have to build out these thousands of reactors to churn out electricity to keep things going until either breeder reactors or fusion come online. And it was never something. Everyone knew that it was never something that could last because there's only so much fissionable uranium, and the various things that are being talked about, the breeder reactors, the thorium reactors, all this stuff. All of that had been tried, and it didn't work. Unfortunately, we were being promised in those days that fusion, that commercially viable fusion power, was only 20 years off. And at this point, it's still at least 20 years off, and there's some reason to think they may never get there. But that was the gamble that they were taking, that we could do that and make the transition and end up with enough power from fusion reactors or from breeder reactors or what have you, that it wouldn't be a problem in the future. We could reprocess the waste. We could do it. It would have landed us in a dead end. It would have landed us in a disastrous dead end. Unfortunately, basically we're there because we've got these millions of tons of lethally dangerous, highly radioactive, highly toxic used fuel rods scattered all over the world. And these are things that have to be isolated from the rest of the biosphere for 250,000 years. Or they start killing everything they come into contact with.
Well, quite. The very idea, that you put forward in Long Descent, that we could be looking at, say, not a sudden collapse, not the end of the species or anything like that, but the end of the world as we know it, the life that we've all had, has been for 100 years or more, and expected to go on into perpetuity. That the idea that's coming to an end for some people just seem like an impossibility. They'll sort it out, quote unquote, as they say. But it's worth remembering that not only societies or empires, but entire civilizations have come and gone. And in some cases, if you read alternative history or prehistory, there seems to be some evidence that some great civilizations have disappeared almost without a trace. So the idea that we are special is simply a fallacy.
It's a very comforting illusion, and people cling to it because otherwise they actually have to face up to the mess that we've made of our future. what we're facing, I mean, you can put it in the very simple terms that you find in a lot of histories of other civilizations that have done exactly what we're doing now. It's a process of contraction, decline, and breakdown, 100 to 300 years long, ending in a dark age. That's where we're heading at this point. And it's all very well to say, well, we can do this, we can do that, we can go charging out and save the world and all that kind of stuff, but yes, that one's been tried too. And the number of people who are actually rallying around that banner is so small that I'm not greatly convinced that it's going to do much of anything. That being the case, if this is the direction we're going, I think we need to think about that and say, okay, what can we do to cushion the decline, to make life as decent as possible for not only for ourselves, especially not only for ourselves, but for the people who will come after us in the centuries and millennia to come.
You address something, and I suppose some of the people we're referring to, with the blinkers on, are caught up in what you refer to in the book as the myth of progress, that things have been getting better, generally speaking, for a long time on a lot of fronts, and that will continue. And as children of the East 70s, I don't know about you, but I was fully expecting in the year 2000 to take delivery of my bubble car, which I was going to hover around in. I was going to go from one domed city to another. I was going to eat paste, which was going to come out of a machine, and the paste would all look the same, but it would taste different. It would explode in my mouth in a sensation of delight, and then we would probably go to Mars or something like that for an afternoon trip.
Oh yeah. I mean, by 2000, supposedly you should, or certainly by 2012, for heaven's sakes, you should be able to go down to your local spaceport and pay a relatively modest fare, climb aboard the British Spaceways or what have you, 6:30 p.m. flight to the moon. You go up to the cities on the moon, and there's bases on Mars. Humanity's expanding into space. But we were supposed to have solved all the problems of poverty and hunger and blah 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 blah. I grew up with that stuff. All of us who were around in the 60s and 70s grew up with that stuff, the sort of Jetsons future, where people were talking in those days that since, of course, total automation of all economic activity was going to happen in just a few years. So the great crisis of the future was, how would people find a way to use their leisure time once nobody had to work for a living ever again? People were saying this. People were taking that seriously. It's very easy to get caught up in these fantasies of progress, but in fact, progress was a fairly temporary phenomenon. It lasted for about 300 years.
It's not a new book by any means. It came out in the early 90s, but there's a book by an author called Jeremy Rifkin, and the book was called The End of Work. And he was examining the crisis of the advance of technology, actually, and how it was making great swathes of the population basically unemployed because they weren't needed anymore. Now, in the future you envision, we would come back very much into needing people again, but where we are right now, with the way things are going, particularly at this moment economically, is giving the lie to that notion of a future where we'd be looking to do more with our leisure time. Because what we have now is people working part-time who don't want to work part-time, people working 3 jobs who don't want to work 3 jobs, and all the while we're being told that technology is getting better and more things are being done for us. So it's that not only the domed cities and the bubble cars went away, but the idea of us sitting around in the afternoon in the park drinking wine and reading poetry, that didn't happen either.
It didn't happen at all, and it never was going to happen. It's very funny to read things from the 1970s that were critiquing this sort of Jetsons future, and yet you have to look hard to find those critiques nowadays. You have to look hard to find the whole Jetsons future business. Everyone kind of scuffs their feet and pretends it wasn't there. But because, of course, it raises some real challenges to the current version of it, the idea that we're going to come up with some kind of limitless new energy resource. You'll hear that all over the place. The current versions of the our future is in space thing, the nanotechnology bubble, and the various other sets of ultimately religious claims. Because progress is our religion. It is the state religion of the modern world. It's very firmly established. Its high priests wear lab coats. And they receive the same kind of lip service and the same kind of status that archbishops had in the Middle Ages. And so people believe in that progress is going to give them, this glorious future somewhere off in the undefined difference, and trying to tell most people nowadays that progress was a temporary blip, that it was something that happened because we raided the Earth's cookie jar of stored carbon, that it basically, for all practical purposes, progress as we know it started in the 18th century and is ending in our lifetime. It's like trying to tell a medieval peasant that heaven, with God and the angels and saints and all that, isn't there anymore. People can't get it. They can't get their heads around it. They're going to have to, because progress is ending right now.
Whatever people might think about, if they're familiar with peak oil, whatever they think about that issue, or whatever they think about any of the things that we've discussed so far, when I go out and about, I mean, we've turned the corner already. What you're talking about in the long descent is not something that, it's not yet more future things we might have to concern ourselves with. We have turned the corner. And if I travel somewhere, I see it everywhere I look. And you've referred to this sometimes in your blog posts at the Archdruid Report, your blog. The signs of decay, just physical decay. And we hear about it on the nightly news if we bother to look or listen. Economic numbers are in, unemployment's up. I've never seen so many happy and unfulfilled people, even though I'm happy and a lot of people I know are happy. We're not happy with everything, but we're making the best of it, which again, I suppose, is part of your ethos. But whether it's an office building that's 4 years old, has never been occupied, and it's to let, or whether it's a factory that's closed down, and or city streets that are not being maintained the way they used to because the money isn't there. Everywhere I look, I see subtle and not so subtle signs that we have turned a corner.
If you want to put a date on the turning of the corner, the date is 2005. In some ways, there were a lot of this developed before that time. It's worsened since then. But 2005 was the year when the world reached its peak production of conventional petroleum. Now, conventional petroleum is the stuff that's relatively easy to get to. It's relatively cheap to produce. You don't have to put a huge amount of energy into extracting it from the ground. That's what powered our civilization. Since then, the quote, petroleum production has remained basically flat. It's bumped up and down. But the actual production of conventional petroleum, again, the cheap, easy, high-energy stuff, has been declining. And we've been filling in the gap, we collectively, meaning industrial society, has been filling in the gap with ethanol, with biodiesel, with tar sand extractives, with natural gas liquids, with anything that'll burn, to try to make up that widening gap between how much will keep our society going and how much we're actually getting from the standard, old-fashioned, not hugely deep, not hugely difficult oil wells.
Well, yeah, you mentioned tar sands there, and there is certainly a scramble at the minute to almost literally wring the last of the oil from the fabric of the earth. But what's not talked about a lot, people talk, we've got tar sands, and there's X amount of oil to keep us going for however many years locked up in this. But these have major problems associated with them. I'm particularly thinking of tar sands. Environmental impact is enormous. And key thing that a lot of people won't have been exposed to in talking about oil is basically the ratio of the energy you put into getting the oil to the ratio out, as it were, which is basically the net energy left at the end of that process, and that's another very big issue.
That's in many ways the biggest issue of all. Thank you for mentioning it. Just to hear the word net energy on someone else's lips is practically a source of joy for me, because nobody wants to talk about it. If I offer you a job and I will pay you, say, £10 a day, but you have to pay me £20 a day to get it. This is not a winning proposition. Okay? This is what happens when you go into negative net energy. If you can get a barrel of oil out of the ground, okay, fine. But if it takes you a barrel and a half to get that barrel of oil out of the ground, that's not an energy source anymore. This is the case with a huge number of our supposed energy resources. It takes more energy to produce the energy you're getting than you get back from the process. And at that point, you're basically wasting your time. You're not actually producing energy. A lot of what's going on in, for example, the Alberta tar sands is that phenomenal amounts of natural gas, which is cheap at the moment, are being burnt to extract a relatively modest amount of tar from tar sands, and then that has to be processed, various things have to be done, all of it very energy intensive. Right now in North America, we're going through a natural gas bubble. We've got immense quantities of natural gas as a side effect of basically an economic bubble that's going on in shale gas. It's modest amounts of natural gas being produced and immense amounts of money being produced, mostly from Wall Street. But so that we've got a little bit of a glut of natural gas here in North America, and that natural gas is being burnt like it's no tomorrow to get other energy sources. So you have this process of scraping the bottom of the barrel, whether it's tar sands, whether it's shale oil. I mean, the big shale oil deposit has been known for decades. It's only now, with oil prices upwards of $100 a barrel, that it's economic to do the whole fracking routine and pump out the shale oil. And there's not that much of it. A lot of people have been making grandiose claims, but there's not that much of it. And the fact that we've gotten this close to the bottom of the barrel, the pipe is gurgling as it tries to slurp up the last remaining crud at the bottom. This is a warning sign. This is something people should be going, oh boy, time to hide under the bed.
I can imagine the globally being heard at 1 million decibels of sound, a little bit like when I was a kid and I got to the bottom of a milkshake with the straw. The sputtering that happens when there isn't quite enough to keep air out of the straw. That's what we're hearing right now. Now, net energy is also one of the big issues when it comes to renewables, because again, this is not talked about on the nightly news or on any of your mainstream documentary programs. That, say, for example, as I understand it, you can put me right here if I'm not correct, that with the energy ratio in to out for, say, the best quality oil, light sweet crude, could be as much as 200 to 1, perhaps. But right. Talking about renewables, that is to say, you expend this 1 unit of energy getting the oil and you get 200, which you can then use. I mean, that's a good deal by anybody's numbers. But with some renewables, it can be as little as 2 to 1. That's 100 times less stuff. And if you extrapolate that into an actual reality in a future, it would say, like, can you imagine the world with, say, 100% less 100 times less of everything, less cars, less schools, less shops.
Yeah, with 1% of the energy that we now use. Imagine everybody taking a 99% pay cut.
Yeah, that's better. Sorry, I mean, mental arithmetic has never been my strong suit.
Well, there you go. But no, you're quite right. No, in fact, there are also a fair number of renewable energy sources, quote unquote, that have negative net energy, where you have to put in 2 barrels to get 1 back. And the only reason anybody can do them right now is we still have the oil. And then you have some that are fairly close to break even. Photovoltaics are that way. They're making a big splash about photovoltaics. Let's look at the energy that has to be used to make these things. It requires very complex technologies. It requires very highly refined rare earth metals, silicon, pure crystalline silicon, or amorphous silicon. Has to be made in clean rooms under exacting conditions. Energy, 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 energy. All to make a panel that will produce, a very modest amount of electricity whenever the sun shines on it for 20 or 40 or however many years it lasts. So the thing that it's great if you have a lot of energy now and you want to make a whole bunch of photovoltaic panels with some of that energy so that you'll still have energy when the oil runs out. It has some advantages that way. There are actually renewable technologies that do provide respectable amounts of energy, but they're not the kind of things that you can use to power an industrial society. For example, solar hot water. Don't know how well that works in your neck of the woods, but in much of the world, you can put a solar water heating system on your roof and provide the vast majority of your hot water, say maybe 10% of your annual energy take. And this is a very important thing. Having hot water for washing dishes, washing clothes, all this is health-related stuff for baths and what have you. You can have a more comfortable lifestyle than you would have without it. You cannot run industrial society on nice hot baths.
No, I mean, this is not the same. Heating your water to an acceptable temperature for use even in winter is not the same thing as keeping the lights on in London or New York or Tokyo.
Exactly. But if you start with the recognition that we're not going to keep the lights on in London and New York and Tokyo, and that's the hard thing for most people. Once you get past that, you start looking at, okay, what can we do to arrange for a decent, humane, livable lifestyle for people in a post-petroleum world? And things like solar water heating, that's a very important technology for that. That can save vast amounts of fuel. It can save vast amounts of trouble. It has health benefits. Passive solar heating for houses, same kind of thing. Wind on a small scale, not these gargantuan bird-killing monstrosities that they're tacking up all over the landscape. Those only have value. Well, mostly they have value as trophies to prove that, how ecologically conscious one is if one is a politician. But they're meant to feed the grid. They're meant to feed the fantasy that we can keep the lights on in London and New York and Tokyo. And if you get beyond that, you say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to look at how much energy we can produce on a local small scale, and we can do that with the kind of little wind turbines that, certainly in the Great Plains of North America, every reasonably prosperous farm had 75 years ago. So you're running, 6 light bulbs and a radio. Life with 6 light bulbs and a radio is peripheral to life without it. You've got the ability to do things after dark. You've got a connection to the outside world. You can hear the news. You can hear music. This kind of stuff, worth having. It doesn't keep the lights on in Tokyo. It doesn't keep the lights on in London. And so if we're actually looking at renewable technologies that matter, we have to look at the renewable technologies that will respond to the needs we're actually going to have in the deindustrial age and the realities of the very sharp limits to what we can produce, what we can do, what we can expect to save.
Now, if anyone's in any doubt about the fact that they can look perhaps in the media and see a lot of news currently about the resource prices and where things are headed. I mean, the oil price isn't exactly through the roof at the minute, but you can see pressure on a lot of other areas, including what you referred to earlier, sort of rare earth metals and minerals. Now, a lot of stuff, you look at the bottom in the pages of financial papers, you'll find stuff about this all over the place. And it's been popular to say for some time about war in the Middle East, for example, that's about oil, and people almost are blasé about that now. They say, oh yeah, they went in there for the oil, so what? But think about it. So if they went in there and killed whatever, 1 million people in Iraq, or whatever they've been doing over the decades here and there, and continue to do, Libya, all what's going on in the Middle East, if they're doing that for oil, okay, that suggests that there isn't a lot of it. It's not that easy to get hold of, and they'll do anything to get it.
Exactly. Back in the 1970s, President Carter, as it was then, proclaimed as a central pillar of American foreign policy that the United States must have access to Middle East oil, and we will do anything to get it. He said that publicly. And it's been one of the centerpieces of American foreign policy ever since. That's true of all of America's allies. It's true of all of America's enemies. Everybody has their eye focused on the big remaining petroleum reserves because that's where the rubber meets the road. As far as the price of oil not being through the roof, by the way, last I checked, it's about $103 a barrel. And 10 years ago, when it was $19 a barrel, the suggestion that it would be $103 a barrel would have caused serious economic types to laugh. They would have said, no, it can never get that high. Of course we'll have enough oil. Well, guess what?
Yeah, well, I think the thing there is, one, that in my mind I was probably thinking of relatively short-term moves where, as to where the oil has been in the last year or so. But also there's undoubtedly a fact that we all get used to our new situation quite quickly, and we forget about it's the same with price inflation in general. You could get a pint of beer in the 70s for 30p, and now it's 10 times that price or whatever. And because it happens over a relatively long period of time, we come to accept each little step.
Yeah, exactly. We don't notice that the prices of everything, is climbing, and especially these days when governments are massaging the statistics so remarkably, we insist. The government says inflation is under control. Of course, prices are going up quickly, but we don't have any inflation. I mean, it's very, very, very doublespeak.
Oh yeah, I'd refer people, particularly in the US, to a website called shadowstats.com, a gentleman called John Williams. And if you want to have your eyes opened as to what the US government's up to with its number crunching, you could. That's your one-stop shop. But you mentioned food, food price inflation is one of the things that's most pronounced at the minute, and of course it affects everyone. We've all got to eat, and especially if you're in a marginal financial situation, you're being squeezed, maybe lost your home, lost your job. You still got to eat, but then that suddenly becomes a bigger part of your expenditure, and the proportion that families are spending on food now has been increasing quite substantially after decades of decline. And in that, we touch upon some key areas that are really going to be crucial going forward and will be very much affected by the oil situation set out in the long descent. And that is, of course, food, first of all, and then our other great dependency, water, and, of course, on population itself, and the population of the Earth, which continues to increase, and not only increase, but increasingly use energy, as we see in China, for example.
Yeah. Well, China, one of the things that needs to be factored in here is the relative decline of the existing major powers and the rise of China, India, and a couple of other nations toward global power. China's getting a bigger share of oil every year, and the United States at this point is having a fairly steady decline in its share of oil every year, which is one of the reasons our economy is going to pot, even though the politicians won't talk about that. Empires go. We've had an empire since the end of the Second World War, when we basically elbowed in and took over Britain's empire. And Britain had its couple of centuries of empire, and before that it was Spain, and so on. It's a very standard process. It's imperial states, hegemonic states that control large sections of the world rise and fall. The United States is very much on the downslope of its imperial cycle, largely because we massively mismanaged the process. And China's very clearly taking in the resources we would normally claim here in the United States. So the fact that China and to a lesser extent India, Brazil, a couple of other countries are increasing their share of petroleum, broadly speaking worldwide, many people are having to make do with less. And in particular, a number of the countries where energy use has been just phenomenally over the top. The United States, again, where up until quite recently, the 5% of the world's population who lived here used 25% of all its energy and 33% of its raw materials and industrial product. That's not going to last. That isn't lasting now. And so there's a lot of redistribution going on. Population, though, more broadly, I see population as an effect rather than a cause. We went through a period of immense energy abundance. There was plenty of food, there was plenty of energy, there were plenty of resources, and so we got plenty of people. We've already seen in the former Soviet Union, in a number of other places, population curves start turning down sharply, not because there's mass die-off, epidemics, or zombies stalking the landscape, but simply because the rate of births has dropped well below the rate of deaths. And so you have the sort of the same demographic shift that gave us 7 billion people is actually reversing over large parts of the world, and you start having the death rate climb and the birth rate drop. And you start having just ordinary diseases, of course, rates of alcoholism up, rates of drug abuse are up, rates of suicide are up, all the usual social stress things. And the population is it hasn't started to slump yet worldwide, but the climb is leveling off fairly dramatically. And I think we're going to see over the decades ahead that decline and increase tip over into a downward movement. That's not to say it's going to be pleasant. That's not to say that it's not going to be a miserable experience for many of the people involved. But I don't think we're going to, the claims that you get from some of the cornucopian types who insist, no, we're going to have like 9 billion people, 30 billion people, what have you, is complete nonsense. The planet can't hold that many. The planet can't support that many. As we bump up against the limits to growth, we're going to see a lot more deaths and a lot fewer births.
Now, in America, what's happening at the minute, I think it particularly makes the headlines because just for so long it was, the land of plenty, and everyone around the world wanted to go there, and if not be American, at least have their chance at living the American dream, and everything seems so prosperous, and it was just, milk and honey in the streets and streets paved with gold, etc., etc., etc. And there's a change happening there now, which is very marked and very profound. 50% drop in property prices in some places. Las Vegas, I think, is particularly badly hit. Gasoline prices through the roof. People being evicted left, right, and centre. Tent cities, things that we normally associate with the almost second world, if not third world, cropping up in the States. And this is all happening at a time when we've got this profound, have had since 2008, the global financial crisis. Now, to some extent, that's an artificial thing. It's having real effects in the real world, but we know the money system is just a ghost of nothing. And it doesn't really affect, it doesn't increase the resources we have, it doesn't decrease them. Well, I guess it probably does cause them to be burnt through quicker, but
yes.
The artificial money construct system gets overlaid onto what's really happening with resources, and it makes quite a confusing picture. I mean, where do you see the current economic crisis fitting in with what's happening overall with regards to resources and energy?
Okay, you already touched on the crucial point which so many people miss, which is that money is not wealth. Wealth consists of actual goods and services produced through the use of energy. Money is a set of tokens, a set of abstract, artificial, socially created tokens that allow us to distribute and arrange who gets how much of the available wealth. Since the arrival of peak oil in 2005, since we got onto the plateau in the very early 2000s, about a decade ago, there has been all of these economic problems that nobody in the economics profession seems to be able to deal with, because things are not happening the way they're supposed to happen. The buttons and levers of the economy are being pushed and pulled and yanked this way, and things are not responding. The problem is they've gotten so used to manipulating money that they've forgotten that there's this whole other world of wealth. The wealth available to the modern industrial world is contracting. And so what are they doing? They're trying to increase the amount of wealth by increasing the amount of money. So we have quantitative easing, okay, or whatever the various euphemisms that are used for printing money. At this point, the Federal Reserve Board here in the United States buys roughly 2/3 of our national debt every year. Are they getting the money from that for anyone else? No, they're printing it. They're literally spinning the presses, manufacturing the money, using that to pay off or to buy bonds for the current national debt. This is Zimbabwe economics, and this is going on. We're not the only country that's doing it, but the U.S. is certainly the leader of that particular pack. Trillions of dollars a year in money that's just being spun into existence to pay for debts that the U.S. is running on because it can't live within its means. This will not end well. The problem is that, again, the money system has become completely detached from the real economy of goods and services, which is contracting as its energy basis declines. And until that's recognized, until people in some positions of authority start coming to terms with the fact that the industrial age is ending, that the amount of goods and services, the amount of real wealth that we have is going to contract from here on in. It'll be ragged, it'll be up and down, but it'll be mostly down from here on in for the next 100 to 300 years.
And I think that
just as it expanded for about 300 years, it's contracting now. And until we come to terms with that, the economic mess is just going to get worse.
Well, I think one of the challenges for those of us who would like to live differently or do something about this, do something constructive at least on our own part, is the time scale that you're referring to, which allows for a lot of kicking the can down the road. Because if you're saying in 100, 200 years that these change, and even then we don't know how things are going to look. But this is a sort of order that we're talking about, to have a great change away from the site we have now to something different. It's very easy for people to sort of carry on and say, okay, I'll just put my head down again. That's fine. Doesn't affect me. I'll be dead. If I'm lucky, I'll live till I'm 85, and that's that. But a point must come, and as I say, referred to earlier, we have turned a corner where it's no longer just so easy to put your head back down and carry on, because you're starting to feel just the first little trickles of that tidal wave starting to touch our toes now. It's kind of like you're coming up against the first signs that that things are changing, and this reinforces your idea of not of a sudden overnight collapse, but of a gradual change. It's one thing for people to wake up in the morning and turn on the TV and it's not working, turn on the radio, it's not working, and then suddenly there's a load of marauding people outside their house. That's sudden collapse.
The Hollywood fantasy, yeah.
Yeah, and then you're thrown straight into dealing with it. But in a way, this gradual creep, this gradual decline, stepping down the ladder, as you refer to it in the long descent, that can be very difficult to deal with. And we do face social and cultural and technical challenges. But ultimately, it's in our own minds is where the real battle with this is going to be fought.
The crucial thing is to realize that it's happening, to recognize that it's underway. There is this great scene in the Monty Python film Eric the Viking. I don't know if you saw it. It's where the island of High Brazil is sinking, and King Arnold, I forget which of the Pythoneers it is that talks about this. King Arnold is there giving this big speech about how, well, of course, there are all these fantasies and rumors about how High Brazil is sinking, but let's face facts. We all know we've got all these protections in place. Nothing's happening. The water's rising up above his knees as he's saying this. Okay? And it's actually one of the best images for what's going on right now as people try to make believe that there isn't a problem. But if you look around yourself, if you pay attention, if you notice that just putting your head down and keeping on going is landing more and more people in financial catastrophe because the jobs that they counted on being there goes away. We can't, sooner or later it sinks in that we can't just keep putting our heads down because it doesn't work. Because we put our heads down and walk ahead and all of a sudden we've fallen off the cliff. Because it's the idea of sudden collapse actually does have some relevance. It's just that it's not hitting everyone at once. I forget who it was that said, the apocalypse is here, it's just not well distributed yet. When some middle class person who has a decent job and he has a house and he has this and that, and all of a sudden the job goes away forever, and there are no more positions available. I mean, there's lots. There are still some, but there are 66,000 people applying for every position, and you're not going to get it. That person has just been through collapse, and is going to have to downshift. I know a lot of people like this, where they're moving back in with their parents. There are 8 or 9 people, and there's one salary because there's only one person left with the job, and so you have to start growing food in your back garden or in your allotment or what have you. You have to start conserving energy, saving this, recycling things, not like taking it to a recycle center, but actually repurposing things yourself. You have to start making do with salvage. You have to start using your own labor to produce goods and services in the household economy because that's the only thing you have left. And each person who goes through that is actually going through the collapse of a civilization. It's just one person at a time.
Exactly, and all these different degrees, it may all be heading in the same direction. But, for example, it was reported yesterday on the news, one example that comes to mind was that Jaguar Land Rover, maker of luxury vehicles selling to the world, that great profits rise from them. And this, obviously, more people are buying their vehicles than ever before. Maybe not in terms of numbers, but certainly they're making more money doing it. And there was a guy in the media within the last year talking about the sales of Rolexes and Porsches were up in the US, which on the face of it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but what we're seeing is not only the uneven nature of this step-down collapse, but the fact that in the book you refer to partial periods of recovery, and that can be over years, but it can also be not everyone's doing really badly right now. Some people quite unfairly are doing absurdly well.
Well, one of the consequences of the spinning of the presses, of the flooding the economy with paper money, is that people who have access to those flows of paper money can buy a lot of things. They can buy an unfair share. They can buy the Jaguar. They can buy the Rolex watch. They can buy, because they've got access to this flow of money. And while the money still maintains its value before hyperinflation sets in, as it will, there's a lot of things you can get with it. Because people are desperate, people want to sell. It's a very convenient time to have access to a flow of money because you can actually get quite a bit with it.
Now you referenced the idea of various little, fronts on which people were personally dealing with their changed circumstances. Producing some food at home and maybe reskilling in something that would be if they were already in IT, that they mightn't realize that had gone away for them, that maybe they could learn to repair shoes or something useful, that they could make a living at a lesser level, but it would still, going forward, it would probably have a future.
Exactly.
And I think when facing what we are facing, people initially, of course, turn to authority, those in charge, specifically the politicians. And what we're seeing increasingly now with either inaction or incompetence or actual malfeasance at the political level, we're seeing an increase in protest. And the idea being, well, if the politicians won't change it, then we'll go out there and wave placards and we'll make sure it gets changed. But that's proving to be futile, as we see the way the protesters, for example, at the G20 are treated as what basically look like a load of stormtroopers descend on them and beat the living crap out of them. So going forward, as the change comes down on us, operating initially looking after yourself and then look at those nearest to you and those around you will offer a way forward for us, because protesting and appealing to politicians is not going to work.
The politicians don't know what's going on. They have no clue. They don't get it. There are very good reasons why they shouldn't get it, because one of the things that's going to happen down the road is that they're toast. Their entire world is toast. The only reason that the politicians and the financiers, the modern rich and powerful have the wealth and the power that they do is that they know how to manipulate, and they're in a position to manipulate this very complex, very intricate, very brittle, very fragile system that runs on vast amounts of fossil fuel energy. As that system breaks down, their power goes away. And they're going to be in roughly the same situation as all those heads of communist parties in Eastern Europe when the communist parties in Eastern Europe suddenly dissolved out from under them. This is what happens when very complex civilizations start breaking down. The former leadership finds that it has no skills at all that are relevant to the current situation. In the meantime, they're going to defend their grip on the levers of power and the flows of money with everything they've got. And yes, you can go out there and protest. You can wave a sign. You can shout obscenities at the status quo or what have you, and it will either be ignored, or if it becomes sufficient embarrassment, the police are going to come in and beat the living crap out of you. Or eventually you may be dragged from your bed at 3 a.m. and shot in the head and tumbled into an unmarked grave. This is the kind of thing that can happen. It's the kind of thing that does happen all the time in the third world. And one way we can understand our current situation is that the modern industrial nations are becoming third world countries. Because a third world country is a country in the modern world that doesn't have access to a lot of energy.
Now, one other, I won't call it a popular reaction to societal upheaval and the threat of potential collapse, but it certainly looms quite large in the popular imagination, is the notion of survivalism. That is to say, holding up in a bunker or a lodge somewhere in an isolated location with a stockpile of food and everything else you might need, firearms, waiting to fend off the marauding hordes that will descend upon you once the cities go up in flames and the populace go out looking for whatever they can get. I don't fancy that myself, I must say, being on either side of that particular coin. And in the book, you do address this, and you say that whether it's a sudden collapse or whether a gradual collapse, holding up on our own is not really the way to go. Because I'm reminded, and to refer back to the Mad Max films that I mentioned earlier, in the first one you have the society on the brink of collapse. In the second one you have relatively sudden collapse and people all feeding on each other. In the third one, which is the least good of the trilogy actually, but you have Bartertown, you have the beginning of the realization that actually the only way we're going to get out of all this is to cooperate together. So whatever happens, the thing that you stress in the book, building community, is going to be much more important than any survivalist fantasy.
Oh, yeah. The thing is, one of the things that I think survivalists tend to, well, there are two things that they tend to forget. First of all, the survivalist strategy would only have any chance of working if it's a very fast collapse. If we're looking at a transformation over 100 to 300 years, a deer camp in the hills with a couple of cases of baked beans and enough ammo to equip a Panzer division is not going to do you any good at all. But it's also worth remembering that if you're sitting up there all by yourself or with a couple of friends and you've got the cans of the beans and the ammo and the other valuable things, you are going to be a magnet for everyone else with a gun who wants to take your stash. And sooner or later, you will fall asleep or be at the wrong window at the wrong moment. Generally speaking, and this is very typical for a civilization that's based on consumerism, many people want to know, what can I buy to keep myself safe? What products can I buy and stash that will save me from this? It doesn't work that way. Because if the only value you've got to the future is the stuff you're sitting on, somebody else is going to come along and take you off that stockpile, sooner or later. If your value to the future is what you can do, that's another matter. One of the things I tend to advise people in this country, especially where we have so little good beer, is to encourage people to learn how to brew beer. Okay, if Attila the Hun comes riding up to your front door and you can hand him a mug of decent beer, you've got a friend.
So I wondered when you would get round to this, actually, because one of the things I had on my notes was beer, just the word beer, exclamation mark, because when I read the book, you referred to beer sufficiently often that I thought, this guy likes beer. Indeed I do. Not in an out of proportion way, but he stresses the idea of beer making as a skill to be very valuable. And indeed, I just want to say I'm a fellow fan of real ale, the proper stuff. And I did get some good stuff out of the States recently called Blue Moon. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Yes, these days we're in the early stages of the rediscovery of decent beer over here, and so I'm hoping that among other things, my advocacy for beer brewing will get more people thinking about something other than that ghastly yellow piss water that passes for beer in the eyes of most Americans.
Bud Light.
Oh man, I wouldn't even use that on slugs.
But no, your point is, the serious point is well made. It's like what you can bring, what you can offer to yourself, to a community, to the world, things that will have always been of use. They may have been temporarily out of fashion or even seen as obsolete, in quotes, but that will not always be the case.
And in fact, in times where there has been complete anarchy, I'm thinking of the pirate societies of the Caribbean, for example, the most violent, lawless human societies in history, some of them. Somebody who had a useful skill, their life was sacrosanct. You don't hassle the physician. You don't hassle the shipwright. Various people like that. You do your brawling somewhere else because this guy is going to can save your life. And this is the kind of thing that tends to work in times of social collapse. If you have skills that other people need, they will make sure that you're okay, because it's that valuable to them. If you can patch up their bullet holes, or if you can brew them beer, if you have these skills, you're necessary. You are necessary to their survival. They will make sure you survive. And this is one of the things that I tend to stress in talking to people of this. Get some useful skills, partly because you're going to need them now, partly because other people are going to need them later, and partly also because these are things that need to be passed on to the future. And if nobody knows how to do them 200 years from now, it's going to be a miserable experience, or more miserable than it has to be.
Well, I read the section of The Long Descent where you talk about some of these things with a sort of pang of regret and guilt somewhat, because I personally feel useless compared to my grandfather, who could turn his hand to anything. He could build, do masonry, woodwork, metalwork. He could fix a car. He could just do things that he sort of obliquely offered me the chance to learn from him, because my father wasn't in the picture, so it was my grandfather. And I kind of politely, thanks, Pops, thanks for showing me that stuff, but I'm more interested in, my guitar or whatever. And or being with my friends, and even that's just 2 generations ago, and I now is basically middle-aged. I feel hopelessly unskilled compared to even a man of his generation. And I suppose, I should just say that's down to me to do something about it, I suppose, isn't it, really?
Yeah, well, the thing is, most of us are in that situation unless we've already got to work. The important thing is not to let the magnitude of the difference blind us to the fact that there are actually things we can do right here, right now. Choose a skill. Don't let yourself get, and this is something I have to tell a lot of people, it's very easy to get weighed down by being aware of the gap between where you are and where people were 2 and 3 generations ago. But at least you can choose a single skill right now and get to work learning it. There's a Russian proverb about not how it's a bad idea to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we have to focus on the good now, not on the perfect. The perfect will come if it eventually gets there. But what can we do now? And it's Ernest Thompson Seton, who was a naturalist and an artist and a very interesting person in the late 19th, early 20th century, had a slogan that he used: "Wherever you are, with what you have right now." And I think that's a really good slogan to keep in mind as people start grappling with the consequences of the long descent that we're already in. Wherever you are, with what you have right now, you can learn something now. You can develop skills now. You can do certain things now, and at least make a start.
And it isn't all about the future that a lot of people may feel that they may never experience. It is about now as well, because in doing things like in adopting certain coping strategies, reducing your energy use, and as we just discussed, maybe choosing a new and more viable profession, or taking charge of your own health and what have you, and community networking, a lot of positives can flow from that immediately.
Exactly. It, among other things, let's take energy conservation. You can actually find, I don't know if it's true on your side of the pond, but certainly over here, you go into a used bookstore, you can find a lot of old books from the 70s that'll explain to you how to do energy conservation. You put that stuff to work, you can easily cut your energy use by half. That's money in your pocket right now. It's not for some far future purpose. It's called, having an extra 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 pounds a month to play with. Or you decide to get rid of your car. If you live someplace where you can manage it, where you are with relationship to where you work, if that can be made to work, and sooner or later you're going to. It really is that simple. But in the meantime, you get rid of your car. This is something I've experienced. I don't own a car. I've heard it from many other people. Then you suddenly say, where is all this money coming from? Because all of a sudden you don't have the car payments and the insurance and the gas and the maintenance and all the rest of it. And there's all this additional money in your life. You don't know where it came from. I know half a dozen people who've had that experience. There's a lot of this stuff that can improve your life immediately. Right here, right now. We are already in the long descent. So it's not about the future. It's about taking steps right now to deal with where we are, with what we have right now.
And of course, I'm drawn to think, mine wandered off when you were speaking there, tangentially thinking about all the people who never, we had this sort of all the biggest slice of the pie during the industrial era, as the age of oil comes to an end, and all the millions and billions of people around the world, some not yet even born, who never had any of that. And of course, you can see a tension there now, somewhat in China and other so-called emergent nations and developing markets, that they're all scrambling for the things they want, their century of the good life that we had, and that's not really on the cards, is it?
No, most of them are never going to experience that. China's going to get a little of it because it's not merely an emerging nation; it's a rising imperial power, and it can use its clout in the world to redirect increasing resource flows from other countries to itself. Most of the rest of the world is never going to experience that. And that's just we as a species did not manage our brief period of carbon-fueled extravagance that well.
Now, one thing, I guess, as we kind of draw towards the end of our discussion for today, one thing I wanted to mention was something I absolutely loved towards the end of the long descent, when you mentioned the film Dune. And the little section about, because I hadn't read the book since I was a teenager, not watched the film in maybe 20 years, and you reminded me about the Butlerian Jihad in Dune, and perhaps you can say a little bit about what that is and how that fits in with your idea of technology, a lot of modern technology going away, and how it will, once again, we will realize that human beings are more than just users of technology, and that technology is not somehow greater than us. It's actually an invention of ours.
Yeah. The Butlerian Jihad in the Dune universe back in some centuries before the book opens, there was a widespread revolt against intelligent machinery, against computers. The Butlerian commandment is, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the image of a human mind." And one of the characters actually explains to another early on. It's the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, a priestess, basically explained to the main character that once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would free them, but it simply meant that they were enslaved by the people who owned the machines. Now we've taken a different path. And so in the imaginary future of Dune, instead of having computers, you have people who are trained to think. You have people called mentats who have highly trained memories and resource and reasoning processes who can think at the speed of a computer. And people go, well, yes, that's science fiction, but in fact, this kind of thing actually existed in the Renaissance. We have things called the art of memory, the ars memorativa, as it was in Latin. There were various systems of conceptual algebra, like the Lullian art and so on, stuff that you never hear about nowadays. Because our whole society is fixated on this notion that what we ought to do is replace all of our actual human capacities with machines and put it in place of feet. Well, we have cars, or we have various other personal mobility devices. In place of an imagination, we have a television. In place of memory, we have little Blackberries or what have you. We're replacing all of our human capacities with these machines. Well and good, as long as you don't mind being a blob of protoplasm being pulled around and pushed around and by machinery, except for the fact that the energy to run the machines is running out. And so we're faced once again with the question, okay, how are we going to do these things? And the answer is very simple. Trained people, trained minds. There's a world of human possibility that awaits rediscovery, things that our great-grandparents knew about dimly, that our more distant ancestors knew about intimately, because they were part of everyday life. We've forgotten because we pushed it all off on machines. Now the machines are, saying, sorry, we're going now. You got to take care of this yourself.
Are you aware of a guy called John Zerzan?
Oh, yeah.
I just wonder, because I've read something of his recently, and I don't know if you would say his basic premise is that technology has been a bad thing. Not in the simple little things it might have enabled or the people it might have kept alive and the things it might have helped us with, but its overall effect on human society and human interaction. And I suppose that would nexus in somewhat with your idea that the future we are facing, a deindustrializing and technologically simplifying world, can ultimately be a better one if we choose to make it so.
Well, yeah, I disagree with Zerzan's idea that well, first of all, there is no single thing called technology.
Yes.
Okay, there are these whole suites of different technologies, each of which embodies whatever the values were that define it, that were central in the eyes of the people who created it and applied it. While technologies are not value-free, you can't simply say that there is this thing called technology and it is collectively good or collectively bad or collectively anything. I think that there are certainly many technologies that are very good things. And there are other technologies that have generally been very bad things, and a lot of others that have a lot of moral wiggle room in them. So, but there is an extent to which the way that technology has been used, especially in the last century, has been very demeaning and very dehumanizing. It has been very much a matter of replacing the human with an artificial ersatz technological simulacrum, and that has not been good for us as human beings. Now that the energy that makes that possible is going away, we have to redevelop those human abilities that those machines replaced. And that's going to be a strain for a lot of people. But it's a necessary strain, and I think ultimately a healing one.
So when the TV goes off because there's a temporary power cut and people kind of just decide to get angry for a while, eventually they get the Scrabble out and light a candle, and actually they end up having a really good evening. So may it just be like that in a really big scale.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the thing is, one of the things that I highly encourage people to do is to take their television out and chuck it into the dumpster. The single most effective way you can free up time, free up your mind, and get the capacity to do something original, to actually go out and have a life instead of sitting there like a potato on the couch, is to get rid of your television.
Well,
I've also noticed there used to be an organization here in the States called the Society for the Eradication of Television. One thing they do for a fundraiser is they'd get a bunch of old televisions and a bunch of sledgehammers with face protection and gloves, and for $1 a whack, people could beat up the televisions. And you'd find that once people actually took a swing at the thing, they'd start realizing just how much they hate it, how much they loathe the whole thing. And they've just been doing this sort of numb, drug-like TV trance because it's there, but they hate it. Once they get past that and realize it, they hand over a $20 bill and reduce the television to powder. So I think there's a lot to be said for just get rid of your television, reclaim your life.
Well, I mean, not that many decades after television became widespread, it's almost still the perfect metaphor for so many things that are wrong, and possibly the ultimate metaphor of maybe alongside the car, something of this, the age of oil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a destructive force. It encourages people to be passive, to be dependent, to sit at home, stay away from community, and spend all their time drooling over consumer products.
Well, of course, one day, it may or may not be in our lifetimes, but one day we may not be able to have a conversation like this. It may be impossible for technological reasons, and I hope when that happens that maybe we could sit in the garden, light a fire if it gets cold, and share a few beers on the same continent. That would be good. That
would be a good thing.
Well, the idea that the future is going to be somehow less than the past is anathema, I think, probably to a lot of people, but it is happening. It's going to happen, and the long descent has begun. The industrial age is, to all intents and purposes, over.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's ending. We're still going to have and we can talk about that at some future date when we talk about my book, The Ecotechnic Future, where I talk about the various stages by which the industrial age winds down.
Well, I very much look forward to that. John Michael Greer, author of The Long Descent, thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I've enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for this time. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to check out John's blog at thearchdruidreport.blogspot.com, and of course his books, including The Long Descent, are available at Amazon and all worthy outlets. Now look out for a future part 2 when John will be joining us again, and we'll be discussing his other book, or one of his other books rather, The Ecotechnic Future. The end of the industrial age has begun. It is indeed the end of the world as we know it. What awaits us on the other side is up to us. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.